I don't know yet. I think I have enough chicken salad to put in some.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We are right at noon, so I am delighted to welcome everybody today to this PSC co-sponsored brown bag. The title for today's seminar is How the Measurement and Meaning of Family Structure Shape Research on Young Adult Racial Inequality. This is a special event, and it's the first jointly sponsored between Michigan's Population Study Center, ISR's Inclusive Research Matters series, and the Michigan Program in Survey and Data Science. This event is being recorded, and there are captions available, which you can toggle off and on using the closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen. I'm very pleased today to have two outstanding panelists to join this discussion. Before I introduce them, however, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Sherry Notaro, ISR's Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
Thank you so much, Paula. It's great to see you here today. As ISR really continues to work on promoting an inclusive and diverse and equitable workplace culture, I'm really excited about this partnership that's sponsoring this inaugural Inclusive Research Matters series. This series signals ISR's transparent and deliberate commitment to examining the role of inclusion in the research process. The idea for the seminar series arose from discussions within the DEI Educational Programs Working Group. We were focusing on the role of inclusion in research methodologies, including the measurement of constructs, sampling, and research topics. Who are we including in our research? How do we ensure representation? And how do we measure constructs across intersectional identities? These are questions that will be explored within the series. So I do hope that you will attend our remaining presentations in the series in October, November, and December. And we will certainly advertise these presentations throughout ISR. So again, I'm very much looking forward to today's presentations, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks very much, Sherry, and thanks for your leadership to get this series off the ground. So I will begin by introducing our two panelists. Dr. Bethany Latique is Associate Professor of Research Methods and Human Development and Family Science in the School of Education at George Mason University. She received her PhD in Health Education and Family Studies and her Master's in Family and Community Development from the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Latique employs community-based participatory and action research approaches to conduct research in partnership with families systematically marginalized by society to promote family health and science. Health and justice, I'm sorry. She is keenly interested in how social policies and practices facilitate or hinder family functioning and health across all families. Her work in family science journals and her work appears in family science journals, including the Journal of Family Theory and Review, Family Relations, and the Journal of Immigrant Minority Health. Her action and advocacy work has led to legal changes strengthening grandparents' rights as caregivers to children in Montana and to the creation of the Montana Immigrant Justice Alliance. She is currently board president-elect of the National Council on Family Relations, the leading family science professional organization for family scholarship and practice. Dr. Christina Cross is a 2019 University of Michigan graduate in the Sociology and Public Policy programs and a former PSC trainee, known to many of you. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow and incoming assistant professor of sociology at Harvard University. Her research on within and between group racial and ethnic variation in children's experience of family composition has appeared in Journal of Marriage and Family, Population Studies, Demography, and Journal of Family Issues. Her scholarship has received numerous awards, including the Rackham ProQuest Distinguished Dissertation Award from the University of Michigan, the Dorothy S. Thomas Award from the Population Association of America, paper awards from the sections on sociology of the family and children and youth at the American Sociological Association, and most recently, the Reuben Hill Award from the National Council on Family Relations for her 2020 publication in Journal of Marriage and Family. So before we move into the panel portion of our presentation, I will note that today's presentation is formatted a bit differently from most of our PSC events in that it is a panel. So I'll give an overview of the topic, and then I'll turn to our panelists to offer so that they may offer their perspectives on opportunities to refine and expand our conceptual and methodological toolkit to advance family scholarship as it pertains to racial inequality in the US. We'll talk until about 12:45, leaving about 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience. And near the top of the hour, we'll transition to a professional development discussion specifically for our panelists to talk with our PSC trainees and PSC postdoctoral affiliates about their own careers. I'll ask that you please keep yourself muted until we open to the Q&A session, at which point you can join the discussion by raising your hand, noting that you have a question in chat, or if the floor is open, just unmuting. Okay, so I'll start off with my overview. And so what brings us to this discussion today is the observation that families matter for how children develop and how they experience the transition into adulthood. Families are the primary social institution through which the resources required for human development are transmitted to young people, including investments of time, money, emotion, socialization, and validation of children's self-worth. Along with what children gain from schools, peers, and their communities, these family-based investments prepare children to become healthy, secure, engaged, and productive adults. Family structure is one concept used by researchers and practitioners from across social science disciplines and from a variety of theoretical perspectives to understand variation in how resources filter through families to children. Broadly, family structure describes the number of people in a child's family and their relationships to one another. In the contemporary United States, the term family structure is often proxied by the set of people a child lives with, most often focusing on their co-resident parents, step-parents, siblings, grandparents, or other kin. Over the last 4 decades, our theories about why family structure might matter for children and our approach to measuring family structure have evolved. Some of the most important accomplishments have included attention to an increasingly diverse set of family forms, accounting for cohabitation, same-sex unions, mixed immigrant status, step family organization, and later life divorce. Family research has also made gains in demonstrating that for many children, family composition is dynamic, that is, subject to change as children grow. And in using improved data, research designs, and statistical methodology to demonstrate that on average in most populations, much of the apparent effect of family structure on young adult outcomes can be explained by selection mechanisms, by family income, and by family process, such as the routines and interactions that comprise family daily life. But today we pause to consider that despite these innovations, fundamental weaknesses remain in how social scientists think about what family is and what it means for families to be embedded in a set of interrelated social, economic, and legal institutions from which resources to children are derived. We describe these weaknesses and consider their implications for research on how family structure shapes the transition into adulthood for Black youth. We focus on 2 themes. First, we ask, who are we talking about when we talk about the people in a child's family? This is a question about how we measure family structure. Who counts as a member of a child's family, and who gets to decide that? Second, when we want to examine whether or why family structure matters for youth, what assumptions underlie our theories, research questions, choice of data, and empirical models? This is a question about how we assign meaning to the family. In particular, we consider the blind spots that both inform and arise from scholarship that focuses on the family discretely and in isolation from other social institutions and phenomena. Both of these weaknesses are profoundly consequential for research on the relationship between childhood family structure and the experience of entry into adulthood for Black youth. Throughout the 20th century and to the present day, Black families have been subjected to social science inquiry from a position that we refer to as the deficit model. That is, the mainstream of quantitative social science research on families has sought to identify weaknesses in Black family organization that contribute to Black young adults' less frequent college completion, weaker labor force attachment, earlier childbearing, and lower marriage rates on average compared to white young adults. Several features characterize the mainstream of this work. First, most often this work focuses on higher rates of non-marital fertility and single motherhood among Black compared to white families. This focus valorizes the married two-parent family as a cultural norm, even as it has become less of a statistical norm. And it overlooks family structures that are similar between Black and white families, including the prevalence of cohabiting parent and step-parent families, and mostly ignores extended and non-co-resident kin as contributors to children's experience of family structure. Second, it ignores variation in family structure and in young adult outcomes among Black families. This focus on racial difference rather than variation within racial groups reinforces the deficit model and implicitly devalues research focused on racialized minorities as a source of insight into family functioning. Third, the legacy of slavery, historical and contemporary structural racism and discrimination, and the increasingly narrow and contingent band of public policies available to support families and children are often invoked to provide the context for divergent family structure patterns between Black and white families. But nearly as often, this context is then set aside to turn the researcher's gaze to theories and empirical models that emphasize family level process. This focus puts families under the microscope without attention to how they dynamically interact with the outside world and without attention to how these interactions differ by race. Collectively, these weaknesses contribute to a persistent pattern in research findings. In quantitative empirical models employing large-scale secondary data sets, the apparent effect of family structure on young adult outcomes tends to be weaker for Black youth than for white youth. In practical terms, this means that empirical research finds that the gains to living in a married two-parent family are weaker for Black than for white youth, and conversely, that the cost to living with a single parent, experiencing parents' divorce, or experiencing frequent change in family composition are smaller for Black young adult outcomes compared to white youth. But once these group differences are identified and described, they are rarely interrogated or explained. We suggest that this persistent pattern signals a problem with the way we measure and interpret the meaning of family structure for children. Surely it is not the case that family structure matters less for shaping the transition to adulthood among Black youth compared to white youth, or that it matters more for white youth. Rather, for discussion today, we discuss current shortcomings and recent innovations in the measurement, theory, and modeling of family structure influences on Black youth, and highlight where and how to challenge the measurement and meaning of family structure to build a more valid and informed approach to family scholarship in social science. So with that background, I'd like to turn to our panelists with a set of questions that we've prepared. And the first is a two-part question that asks the question, what are the weaknesses and how mainstream quantitative social science studies family structure in Black families? And the first part of this question is about measurement, and I'd like to lead off by asking Christina to address this. So the way we pose the question is, for the most part, research on family structure is focused on children's biological, legal, and co-residential relationships to their parents. That is, we treat as the norm that children live continuously with their married, different sex, biological parents and full siblings, and investigate departures from that model. So in your view, Christina, how has this become the dominant model for describing and evaluating contemporary family structure?
Thank you for that question, Paula, and for that wonderful foregrounding of today's discussion. I'm just very excited to be here, and I just want to thank everyone who had a hand in making this event possible. To your question about how we got here, how did this dominant model for describing and evaluating contemporary family structure come to be? I think that in many ways, this focus on continuously married, different sex, biological parents, and full siblings is a function of data availability, historic precedent with respect to data collection, and also researchers' normative assumptions about what constitutes family. And so most contemporary quantitative social science studies of family structure rely on the analysis, relies on secondary data analysis of household panel studies, such as the panel study of income dynamics, which I know you are very familiar with, which began in the late 1960s, as well as other household panel studies like NLSY, which began in the late 70s, or Fragile Families more recently in Ad Health. And so when some of the first major national household panel studies began collecting detailed information about household living arrangements, most children did live with their both biological parents continuously throughout the entire span of childhood. So I'm thinking about the PSID in particular, which began in 1968. And so for most households, the family was encapsulated within one single household, at least one's nuclear family members anyway. But over time, as we know, there has been a growing divergence between families and households as non-marital childbearing, divorce, separation, and remarriage have become more and more prevalent over time. And so for today, there are many nuclear family households that extend. There are many nuclear families, that extend across households. And we can think of that most simply with a child whose parent lives apart from them. But there are many other diverse family structure arrangements in which their entire family is not encapsulated within a household. And so these traditional approaches to data collection that focus on households as a primary unit of analysis for measuring families are not able to fully capture the growing diversity of American family life. And there has been greater attention to this. I think, especially when we think about non-resident biological parents, especially non-resident fathers. But family diversity involves more than just non-resident parenting, even thinking about half siblings as well. And there has been a tendency amongst researchers to continue to follow this historic present with respect to how we measure family structure, in part for a desire to be able to make comparisons and trends in family structure over time. And often I see when I read papers, and I think this actually came up in a discussion last week with Bowling Green State University, there's a desire to use approaches that are widely used. That statement often comes up in different articles that I read. And so that speaks to researchers' desire to be consistent over time and also to be in line with historic precedent. But I would also like to point out that this focus on continuously married different sex biological parents and full siblings does not merely reflect data availability or even historic precedent, because as we know, even in the 1960s and 70s, when the first national household panel studies were being developed, that divorce and non-marital childbearing were already on the rise. And of course, extended family households have existed throughout American history. And this has been especially true for Black Americans. So even at the time that some of these major studies were developed, there was already this growing separation between family and household. And so we can think about this near exclusive focus on nuclear family members in the household unit as a primary unit of analysis as also reflecting researchers' assumptions about who is and who is not family and their expectations about which relatives should be most influential for children's growth and development. And I think it's important to recognize that these ideas in many ways are raced and classed, and that they are largely more consistent with the white middle class experience of family life. But I want to pause here to also give Bethany an opportunity to weigh in on this.
Well, thank you. I will gladly jump in, but it's intimidating to follow you, Christina and Paula. Thank you all for being here and for the opportunity to join into this really, really important conversation. I am coming to this work with a critical feminist lens, and I want to really pick up, I think, where Christina left off, and talk about two really fundamentally important issues with regard to measurement and meaning, and that really centers on the fact that both race and the institution of marriage are socially constructed. And it's problematic because those constructions, the definitions change, and we're trying to measure things, and yet our measurements have been inadequate. When we think about, what does it mean that these are socially constructed? Who benefits from these social constructions? Why have these ideas been constructed in the first place? And I turn to the fact that within a white supremacist and patriarchal society, we could argue that the social construction of race and marriage function to preserve status quo power relations and social control. construction such as race, when not unpacked vis-a-vis structural racism, can serve as a vehicle for driving racism in the US and justifying unequal treatment on the basis of skin color. Of course, there's many laws and policies, rules, and practices that segregate, disadvantage, and harm BIPOC people. Whether it's through, I write quite a bit about institutional betrayals and institutional betrayal trauma, legal violence, the policing and regulating of families. These laws and policies have resulted in family separation, mass incarceration, housing segregation, even disparities in the tax code that we can talk about if that's of interest. If I just going to continue for one more thread. So if it's also been argued, as Paula and Christina have talked about, that the heteropatriarchal nuclear family model, if that's seen as fundamental to the economic and social well-being of all families in our society, such that we've privileged this model in our laws and policies. I write about this, that there are some almost 1,200 federal benefits alone attached to the institution of marriage, while at the same time, these laws and policies have marginalized, denigrated, and disadvantaged other family forms that have importantly been racialized. So this privileging and racialization serves to advantage those who can get into the institution of marriage while marginalizing those who cannot enter either by law or circumstance, or who simply choose not to enter. But much of this discourse around the social construction of race and marriage has not been implicated in many of the studies of race and family structure. And for me, that's really problematic, and where we need to go to fill the gaps in our understanding. And I will pause there.
Can you hear me? You do hear me? Okay, I've got it shows that I'm muted, but I will continue to talk anyway. So Bethany, thank you. And I think that your discussion of that leads us right into our next questions, which is, considering that you are describing that families don't exist in isolation from other social systems, from legal systems, from other social processes and relations, but as you said, our models rarely integrate racism, discrimination, prejudice, and racialized segregation into studies of how families shape child development. So why is it important to take these topics on if we want to better describe the role of family in contributing to children's development and their entry into young adulthood?
Christina, do you want to take, go ahead, you take that first and I'll follow.
Okay, I'm okay with either order. I have two main things that I want to emphasize. And the first is just related to our own ability to adequately understand Black families on their own terms and understand about and to be able to identify the individuals who are most influential in Black children's lives, and understanding the transmission of resources through families, as you pointed out, to begin with, Paula, why we study families in the first place. And it's because we think about the family as being one of the primary social institutions through which resources that are necessary for children's growth and development are transmitted. But if we're not able to adequately capture the individuals who are most important or who play a role in that transmission of resources, then we run the risk of not even being able to understand why families matter for Black youth in the first place. And one example that I think of is example of extended family households. And I've done some research in thinking about individuals who are not a child's biological parents or siblings, but who are related to the child and who often live with them. And so I refer to these individuals as extended family members or extended relatives. And extended family ties have been an important and enduring feature of African-American life. I found in my own research that 60%, so more than half of all Black youth, will spend some time living with extended relatives, but they are often not included in empirical models of family structure when trying to understand the impact of family structure on child well-being. And this is in contrast to white children who 20% of them will live in an extended family at some point. And so we have these very different, perhaps familiar experiences across these two racial groups. And when we structure our models, they're often not reflective of Black children or minoritized children in general's experiences. Amongst Black youth whose parents are college educated, they are dramatically more likely to live with extended relatives. In fact, about 40% of children with a college educated mother, Black children with a college educated mother, will live with extended relatives compared to just under 10% of white children. And so I know sometimes there is, researchers will recommend that we just control for social class or control for some type of indicator of socioeconomic status more broadly construed, but that in itself doesn't really help us to adjust for and really take account of Black youth's familial experiences. But beyond, our interest in trying to better understand the overall impact of family structure, I think it's important to realize that by not thinking about or by not centering the familiar experiences of minoritized groups, we can subtly reinforce white supremacy. And what I mean by that is if we center the experiences of white families, and in particular white middle class families, and we study minoritized families only in relation to them, it suggests that minoritized families and Black families in particular are only important to the extent that they compare to these groups, and that we can't, as Paula pointed out, draw insight about family functioning from these groups. And also to that point, oftentimes when we do make comparisons, there are ones in which Black families or minoritized groups more generally are not looked upon favorably. Paul, I think you kind of spoke to that earlier when you were saying that there are a number of similarities in terms of trends in family structure, like cohabitation and step families that are very similar between Blacks and other groups, but we tend to focus on a family structure that is often not highly valued in American society, and that's the single mother family. And the majority of research on Black families has actually focused on single mother families, although recent census data indicates that for every Black youth that is living with a single mother, there's another Black youth who's living with both biological parents, either in a cohabiting or in a married family, but we have a lot less attention to that. And so we have to really be thinking about how our focus on a particular type of family structure can reinforce white supremacy, or that white families and their way of functioning is the ideal context within which all children should be raised.
Yeah, that's so spot on, Christina. I agree. And I want to just add to that a couple of thoughts. And I had written down a bunch of things, and now I'm going to freestyle. So hopefully this will work. Just to riff off of you a little bit here. So, what's problematic, firstly, with the way we've proceeded, and in looking at in creating this primacy of this one family structure and then bouncing everybody else off of it, I'm not recognizing the structural ways in which that institution is totally privileged, has privileged some people over others. What we've done, so from my vantage point, it's been very harmful, not just because we've denigrated certain families through these deficit perspectives, but we've also focused and targeted interventions focused on changing those particular families that we think are in deficit, that need some kind of change in order to better fit the social model that we're privileging. That is problematic in and of itself, but it it completely abdicates the responsibility of white people in a white supremacist society from researching and understanding the ways in which white privilege and family privilege are manifesting in BIPOC families. And it abdicates our responsibility of researching the structural mechanisms of racism in society, and therefore refocusing our interventions, and corrective measure reparations and reconciliation efforts on structural systems change rather than on targeting families for change. And the other thing I wanted to mention is I keep going back to Christina was talking about the 60s and the work in the 60s and the 70s, and I keep going back there too, and it always is humbling because everything I'm thinking that is new isn't, right? It's all been said already. And reading Andy Billingsley's work on Black families in white America, or who I got to study with him at the University of Maryland too, which was amazing. But I also was reading more recently about the MEIS model, the mundane extreme environmental stress model put forward by Charles Pierce and written about by Marie Peters and others. And in this model of mundane extreme environmental stress recognizes that under structural racism, Black families, brown families, marginalized families are enduring mundane or everyday, yet extreme oppression and environmental stress. And that isn't accounted for in much of the discourse around family structure and child outcomes. There's lots of people who are critiquing this too. I don't want to suggest that's not happening. But I think it's really important to start looking at those mundane extreme environmental stressors as causes of problems rather than family structure as a cause of problems. I guess I'll pause there, just recognizing that I think we've missed so many opportunities to redress and repair what we know is the correlates of structural racism.
Okay, thank you, Bethany. So I'm having an interface problem, so I apologize here, but are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. So so your last point there, I think, led into where I'm hoping we can take our discussion now, which is sort of more optimistic view of where we might be headed as researchers. And so I'd like to ask each of you to say a little bit about how in your own work you've begun to address the weaknesses that you have identified in the research on the relationship between family and young adult outcomes, and maybe to think a little bit about some other important recent approaches you've observed, either in your own field or others. So Bethany, would you be willing to take that on first?
Oh, I can try. So, the journey of this work is long. I do think that I guess I've been thinking a lot about reparative, restorative models that we need to be thinking about. I've been thinking a lot about even just truth and reconciliation panels that are first owning that the ways in which we've been depicting certain families has just been has been a vehicle for perpetuating in many ways inequality rather than redressing those structural harms that have been perpetuated on families for far too long. So what research methods and meaning making can we employ to begin to do some of that work. And for me, I've landed on participatory action research and other anti-racist research methodologies that are applying frameworks of intersectionality and critical theories to really push in differently into this work. I also, in using PAR approaches, I have tried to work in partnership with the communities that I wish to serve and study for their benefit, so that the research that we do together can be used by the community to forge social change. And so I tend to work more qualitatively or using mixed methods, and my colleagues and I build advisory boards with communities, and then we work together to come up with the research questions that the community wants asked, to define what is the problem that they want to redress, versus, scholars problematizing family matters. Why don't we work with families to, in service to them, to problematize what they would like to work on towards social change. And so I write a lot about these methods, approaches, strategies for working to build partnership models. And also more recently, I've been engaging with my colleagues around community coding efforts, which have been fascinating. And in those efforts, we actually code interviews with our community partners in big groups. And it's laborious and incredibly time intensive, but it's incredibly rewarding, particularly when I work across culture and where there are different languages being spoken, to really interrogate meaning of findings and how we're positioning those findings to talk about the families that we're writing about, to make sure that it's strengths-based and not deficit or missing the problem or mislabeling the problem, if you will. And I think there are exciting ways in which these different approaches can be used together, because I think the work of that you're doing, Paula and Christina, is incredibly important and rich. And if there are ways that we can marry, silly to use that word maybe in a conversation about, but if we can marry those methods and approaches, I think at least that would provide a pathway of voice and maybe challenge some of the ways we've been conceptualizing and measuring different variables, applying them to people's lives, and then ultimately also, and how they're going to be applied and misapplied down the way, which I also think is really important. And before I turn it over to Christina, I really want to just get this last point in, that the work that we're talking about must also, it really also needs to have an institution. We really need to think about this institutionally in the academy. The academy is also built on these same ideas of white supremacy and heteronormative patriarchy, and methods of related to any kind of racial justice work. All of this must be unpacked. How are we counting different types of research, funding, pathways to promotion and tenure? How does all of that matter for this work? And we have yet to do a sufficient job in supporting more diversified pathways to tenure and recognition and valuing of different kinds of research. And of course, historically, there's just so much research that has been marginalized, and people have left the academy because they couldn't or chose not to fit into a hegemonic institution that also can be harmful to the self. You know, I'd love to continue that conversation, but I don't want to derail the one we're currently in. So, you know, I hope I didn't leave you too far asunder there, Christina, but I pass it over to you.
Not at all. I really appreciate your words, Bethany, and the insight that you're offering. As a survey researcher, I haven't had the same opportunities, but in part, this is a career choice I'll acknowledge, to be in community with many of the respondents. And I think that that is so important. And I value what you said about even with developing codes and doing that alongside community members. And it makes me think about, you know, what could be done with respect to survey research. And, you know, I think about that as being a promising avenue of perhaps having, you know, some type of focus groups or just having some type of semi-structured interviews prior to developing survey items to get a better sense of who people report as being their family members. Because I imagine, and based on some of the early work that I've done with more flexible measures of family structure, that many of the items themselves are limiting. And many of the individuals who we're most interested in better understanding, especially folks from more marginalized backgrounds or vulnerable populations, may think about the family very differently. And I think it's important to exercise some humility as scholars. I recently heard someone mention that on the panel just last week about family structure measurement, and that really resonated with me. And I think it's important, even as a member of a marginalized group, to be cognizant and aware of that as well, because one, just because I'm a member of a marginalized group doesn't mean that I share the same experiences. And, you know, these groups, as we know, are internally heterogeneous in the first place. But, you know, in thinking about how I have become even more upwardly class mobile, you know, having pursued a PhD, and how that has changed my own status, power, privilege with respect to the academy, but also respect to research, and also how it shapes my opportunities with respect to family formation. So I think these are things that everyone should be thinking about. And I think that can help us to develop more inclusive survey items. And I want to put myself out there and hold myself accountable to that as well. Another thing that I've been more intentional about is being very explicit when I talk about the sources of racial inequality or divergence in racial patterns across groups. One thing that I've noticed when I read many quantitative studies of family structure, especially as it relates to Black families or other minoritized families, is that researchers don't always explicitly discuss, you know, how it came to be that certain marginalized groups have access to fewer resources, even if we acknowledge that that is the case. And by not being very explicit about the sources of this inequality, it can allow for misunderstandings and misinterpretations, or not an acknowledgement of the structural forces that are at play that systematically disadvantage certain groups and lead to disparities and access to resources. And I think that that's important to acknowledge, even if, you know, at this moment, we don't have the perfect measure of family structure, but being able to acknowledge that, you know, it didn't just happen to be the case that Black Americans have much lower rates of marriage or single parenthood. But we can also think about how these families are also being engaged with broader social institutions that can constrain family structure choices as well. And so that's something that whenever I write a paper, I try to be very explicit about as a way to sensitize us when we're thinking through these different social problems, so that we don't necessarily problematize the populations we're studying, right, inadvertently, which is something that I think unfortunately comes up in research. And then in thinking about measurement itself, you know, I, in many ways, am constrained by some of the available data measures, but I've also been on the search to look for opportunities to either add items, survey items to an existing well, add items to an existing survey, or looking for surveys that are already updating different measurement, family structure measures. And so one that I've actually run into is a question I came across with the National Survey of American Life, which is actually housed at the University of Michigan, and also a measure in Ad Health that is at University of North Carolina. And this measure of family structure, there is, of course, a traditional household roster that's included, but then respondents are also asked about the individuals who mostly raised them or who are most responsible for rearing them. And one thing that I decided to do descriptively was just to compare household roster information to those reports of what respondents are saying about who mostly raised them. And what I found is that there are some major discrepancies when we use a more flexible measure, when we allow people to just report for themselves who's most influential or most responsible for their rearing. And so I think allowing for something that's more open-ended in terms of how we pose questions could really be valuable. And just to give you a bit more specifics there, when I compared the household roster measure for Black youth and thinking about the individuals who are asked, thinking about who's at the individuals that they ask about who lives in the household compared to the adults that a child says mostly raised them, about 50% of Black youth had some type of discrepancy between their household roster information. And we think about the presence or absence of biological parents versus other individuals who they're saying are raising them. Often it's a non-resident father, or it's some type of extended relative or some other individual who doesn't live with the child, but this person is reporting that these other adults were really crucial for their upbringing. And there's been a number of qualitative studies that really support this idea. And I'm thinking about studies that are focused on fictive kin or chosen kin, so individuals who are not biologically related to someone, but you regard them as family. Or I think about work on extended kin ties, going back even to Carol Steck's work in the 70s, Linda Burton's work, and many other scholars who are focused on this. So I think that, I don't have the answer, I'll say, in terms of like, how do we do a better job? But I think even with some of the existing measures, and perhaps adding to them, that we can better capture the individuals who are most important to children and youth, and who would matter and who they regard as family. And just being very explicit when we talk about racial inequality, that we're thinking through the structural component and not inadvertently attributing disparities to individuals or their values or behaviors without taking into account these structural forces.
Yeah, and Paula, if I can jump in really quick there, I just, and of course I forgot what I was going to say. In the space of thinking about survey work, one of the things we didn't really talk about yet was, all the variables that are missing that really need to be hopefully inserted in the future relating to measurements of structural racism. So what are those measures? How do we measure structural racism in order to understand how those measures are playing out, those mechanisms are playing out in family life? And the other thing that I hope we get a chance to talk more about is just even the notion, and Christina, what you talked about with regard to choice, right? And that recognizing that choice is constrained by structural inequality. Choice is not equal among all individuals. And when it comes to family life, you can actually find yourself in a structure or a circumstance that you don't want to be in, but yet are constrained in changing that because of your commitments to your children, or because there's not a partner available to you if you're looking to repartner or something like that. And so I think those pathways to flexible inquiries are just going to be really exciting if we can move in that direction. Thank you.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry. So I think you've both touched on the last thing I wanted to get to, but maybe just in the last couple of minutes, I'll give you a chance to identify any other priorities or strategies that you think we should be considering for improving either family structure measurement or for thinking about how families are embedded in context that will help us to improve our scholarship on how family shapes Black youth well-being. Bethany, would you like to start?
Well, I think I jumped in there the last time, so maybe I'll just pass over to Christina if you have some additional thoughts.
Sure. So Paula, to your question about how to better situate families in context, I mean, I think that to some degree, this is something that is a framing issue, but it's also an issue of measurement. And so I was talking earlier about, being very explicit about, how certain variation in family formation across groups came to be. And that doesn't mean every time you write a paper, you need to give a full history, but some acknowledgement, of where it comes from. And also when we think about any other types of disparities across racial groups with respect to family structure, I think that's about framing. And, I think that is something that is in many ways more readily, it's something that we could do a lot quicker. It's something that we could do right now. It's at hand. It's just a matter of thinking about that and being very intentional and perhaps even in some ways better informing ourselves about the history of patterns of family formation in the US and how it came to be, and just always keeping that in mind when we talk about contemporary patterns. I think it's more challenging with respect to improving measurement, but I did, talk about, some more flexible survey items that are included. I think also, I think that technology is continuing to allow us to better capture even where individuals spend the majority of their time, and allowing us not just to rely even on self-reports of like who lives with whom, but I'm thinking about perhaps we could take advantage of new technologies and allowing us to better capture who's in a household. And so one thing that comes to mind, and this would be based on people's sense of comfortability, but most of us use some type of cell phone, a smartphone that collects a lot of information about where we spend most of our time. And I remember without having to change my address in my phone, at a certain point, my phone started trying to route me to my new home address because it knows most days where I end up spending my evenings. And so that would be up to individuals to decide, how much information they want to disclose. But sometimes when we run into issues of like who actually lives here, perhaps we could think about, well, where do you spend the majority of your time? And thinking about family members who live in different households, that's a different challenge because one, I think it's really going to depend on who individuals identify as family when they don't live with them. And so that would be, something that we would really have to figure out how to be inclusive in terms of like who we identify as family members across households, because we know there's variation by race, ethnicity, social class, what have you. But I think it's worthwhile to think about. And then thinking about the transmission of resources across those households. But I actually have seen in some surveys questions about providing or receiving financial or emotional support from individuals that you do not live with, often with research on extended family social support networks. Although many of the surveys that are used there are not the same surveys that researchers use when they're studying family structure. And so it could be a matter of including additional questions related to that as well.
Thank you. Those are all fantastic thoughts for the future. Bethany?
I realize I'm I really appreciate, Christina, your going first, because you are just stimulating even more thoughts for me to contribute. So I appreciate your generativity in the discourse here. Because I work with marginalized communities who are particularly vulnerable to family separation, mainly undocumented immigrant families from Central America. And also I've worked recently with African-American mothers who are living in public housing who experience a high degree of regulation and control in those environments, and a high degree of interaction with social institutions that are monitoring them. And really, in both of those cases, in both of those spaces, I should say, there's, I think I would like to see us really think about harm, fear, threat to family separation. Truth telling gets very complicated when you don't trust who is asking the questions or how these data are going to be used. And even if you as a researcher have good intentions, I worry about who's in power at any given time and what that means for data control, who's going to be regulated, policed, and what are the potential harms to those families who are overly regulated. And because we know there's a tremendous amount of family separation, whether it's mass incarceration or child welfare involvement or family deportation vis-a-vis ICE and Homeland Security, et cetera. So I think about that a lot and how that connects to some of this work, because I think it's all intersecting. And the last thing I just wanted to add is really goes back to my roots. And I think that race comparative studies, really, we must really think about what we're doing when we're comparing on the social construction of race and why we're doing that, particularly if we are not including that contextualization and carefully thinking about the questions we are asking and our assumptions behind those questions. And I just think even if we can push into some of that critical reflexive work, I think that will go a long way to moving us to a place of a more just society to the benefit of all families.
And thank you, Bethany, and thank you, Christina. Your contributions have just been incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking. So we're near 1 o'clock, but I would like to take some time to take questions from our audience and respond to everything, all of the ideas that you've suggested for our discussion. Unfortunately, I'm having these interface problems, and so I'm wondering if I can call on my colleague, Sarah Burgard, to manage any input that's coming in through the chat or hand raising.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Sarah.
So I'm not seeing responses at this point. I know it's a large room and somewhat intimidating after those incredible presentations that we've heard. But if you want to go in reactions and raise your hand, or if you're on camera and you wave around at me, I'll try to see you. Barbara, go ahead and unmute.
I found this all extremely interesting, and this made me think about what Christina was talking about, about substantial family interaction from people who are not co-resident. And I think we should bring into this consideration of Bob Shaney's research about Black families having much less geographic mobility and tending to live very close to relatives, that will influence this. And also think about across Black and white families, in terms of the meaning of co-residence, that the degree of migration matters, but also the nature of communities. If you're living in an urban setting, it's much more possible to have this kind of household type interaction with other households than if you're in a rural area where people are more dispersed. So I think we need to think more how the physical environment in which people and different groups differ in their distribution of living arrangements to bring into account some of these things.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm not sure if Bethany or Christina, if you wanted to respond to Barbara's thoughts.
I think Barbara raises a really great point in terms of there being also racial differences in proximity to relatives. And it is the case that Black Americans are much more likely to live in close proximity to extended relatives. And this actually may facilitate greater exchange of at least instrumental or practical support. In terms of financial support to relatives, I mean, there are ways to get around that regardless of distance. But in thinking about data collection itself, that would potentially be more expensive if you have to go further to identify folks. And we already know how expensive household surveys are now. So that would definitely be a point of consideration in thinking about perhaps other ways to even collect data virtually or by telephone, because distance does matter, and it can be costly.
Well, if we think about children and relatives having substantial impact and input in their lives, that's much more feasible if these other relatives live somewhere where they can stop by and spend a lot of time. And this is sort of emotional, social support, even beyond financial support and such.
Thanks so much, Barbara. I'm seeing that it's a little bit after 1. Paula, would you like me to direct us toward the next stage with
Sure.
trainees?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, well, I guess, Sarah, I will ask you to stop the recording since I think you initiated it after that hiccup. And so